Mr. Smallwood, we were talking last time about some of your involvements in the U.S. and the Socialist Party, and your preaching, or at least politicking, about socialism. Do you still consider yourself to be a socialist?
That's not an easy question to answer, actually, because what's involved is a long number of definitions of socialism. I might just counter by asking, what do you mean? What do you mean when you ask me that question, socialist? What is your conception of socialist, and what is my conception?
Are you still a socialist in the same way then that you were in the 1920s?
No, obviously not. I'm not the same way in anything as I was in the 20s. We do change. When I became a socialist, it was even before the 20s, you see. It was the 1912 or 13 or 14, around there. And at that time, socialism was almost a branch of, well, now in England it was, England, Ireland, Scotland, Canada, the United States, not on the continent of Europe. On the continent of Europe, it was very Marxian. It took straight after Karl Marx. In those other countries, it was tinged very powerfully with the Christian faith. It was highly idealistic, even romantic. It wasn't scientific socialism based on Marx, with the materialist concept of history and the great theory of economic determinism. It was more a reformist, more a moralistic kind of movement, you see. And furthermore, there was no place in the world in 1912 or 1920 or 1930, no place in the world where socialism was being tried, was being put into effect. It was still only a theory. It was a sort of religion. In the United States, certainly when I lived there in the 20s, socialism was believed, it was accepted by hundreds of thousands of clergymen, of writers, editors, of scientists. It was an intellectual thing, you see. Well, now, today, socialism has been put into effect in a number of countries. And today we have what we did not have then. We have an opportunity to see it in practice, not just as a theory, not just as a concept, but an actual form of society. Not that socialism, pure socialism, has been put in complete effect in any country, but largely in effect. The government of Sweden for, what was it, 30-odd years now or more, they were in office so long and then they got defeated. But now they're back again in power again. But that may only be the play of politics, you see. However, some states in Australia had socialist governments. As a matter of fact, in New York, in the 20s, as a newspaperman, I interviewed the socialist premier of Queensland, which is one of the Australian states. He came to New York. Edward Granville Theodore, I remember his name. Fine, big, handsome fellow. He was the first socialist premier anywhere in Australia. And in other countries, there have been socialist governments elected by the people, democratically elected, going in office, taking power with a democratic majority of the votes of the people. So now it's less a mere theory than it used to be. Now we can judge it in practice, the actuality of socialism practiced in any one country. Now, I'm not including here the communist countries. I was down in Cuba, and while I have serious doubts about Fidel Castro's intellectual understanding and acceptance of communism, he is reputed to be a communist. But I think he's only politically, so to speak, a communist because when he was cut off, completely cut off, Cuba was cut off by the United States, who wouldn't buy 3 cents worth of anything from Cuba or sell Cuba 2 cents worth of anything. They just cut them off as if they didn't exist. Well, they had to deal with someone, and the Soviet Union were delighted to take the place of the United States and get a great dominant position in a country a gunshot from the United States, just lying off the coast. You could almost look and see Cuba. It's so, not quite, but so close, you see. And so he began accepting help in hundreds of millions and billions of dollars from the Soviet Union. So I wouldn't include Cuba. They've done socialistic things. They've done things that have always been advocated by socialists, socialist parties, but it's not what you would call a socialist state, you see. Now, after all that spate of talk, of words, let me try to answer the question, am I a socialist now, at the age of 83 almost? And the answer is yes and no. Louis Saint Laurent, the Liberal Prime Minister of Canada, called the CCF, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation, the CCF, now known as the NDP. He said that the CCF, or if he were living now and said the same thing, he would say, the NDP are just liberals in a hurry. You remember that? Liberalism preaches the same kind of gospel as socialists used to preach in the 20s and 30s. But liberalism insists on the absolute, quite absolute necessity for private enterprise, that the economy of a country will suffer if it is deprived of private enterprise. That is, private people, enterprising people, energetic and ambitious, and wanting to make money, wanting to succeed, wanting to get ahead in life, wanting to be better off than most of their people around them. Private enterprise. That private enterprise is an absolute necessity. Now, there are things that you don't dare leave to private enterprise. You don't dare. There's too much selfishness, too much self-seeking, and there are some things that you just don't dare leave it. So what you have to do is 2 things. Number 1, make the rules of the road. You say to an enterprising entrepreneur, businessman, sure, that's fine, old man, go to it. The more you build, the more you're building the country, the more you're building the economy. But take it easy now. Don't poison us all, with acid rain. Don't waste the resources that God gave us, cutting down the forest on both sides of a great river, so that when the snow falls in the winter and in the spring, it mustn't melt quickly and pour into the river and flood one town after the other because you went and cut down all the forest. And so what used to happen as nature made it, as God made it, was that the melting of the snows and the ice would be slow and gradual. But you cut away the forest, make the banks for 20 miles, 100 miles back on each side bare, and there'll be no slow melting. It'll be rapid, and you'll get floods. None of that. You're anxious to make money. You're anxious to build sawmills or paper mills or pulp mills. You're anxious to cut down that forest, and we're willing that it be cut down, but not so much as to cause floods. In other words, lay down the rules of the road and restrain private enterprise. Keep it within reasonable, practical limits, but don't destroy it. Don't wipe out private enterprise. Now, that's liberalism. In fact, the difference between liberalism, in that respect, and Toryism is that Toryism, too, believes in free enterprise. They both do. Liberalism, Toryism, both advocate the retention and encouragement of free enterprise. The private profit system, the private profit motive, the balance sheet system of society. But Toryism in its purest form, which you have today pretty well in the form of the Republican Party, the Republican government of the United States, and the Tory government of the United Kingdom under Mrs. Thatcher, where they believe much, much less than the Liberals do, much less in interfering in private enterprise. Turn the blind eye onto their causing acid rain. You know, don't go interfere. These people have profit to make. They've got to pay dividends to their shareholders, the people who have put their money into this enterprise. Don't go circumscribing them. And so, but there was a time, you know, when Toryism was absolutely against any kind of social welfare. They were against old age pensions. Family allowances were an absolute obscenity. They voted against it, you know, in the Parliament in Canada, at Ottawa. The Tory party was absolutely against family allowances. Today, it would be a pretty brave Tory in Canada who would speak against the welfare state, although even Liberals have to recognize that the welfare state, which is a sort of substitute for socialism, but is not socialism, but is a sort of, has gone hog wild, has gone too far. So, all right, now, what does all this boil down to? It boils down to this, that the great social ideals of socialism, of course I believe in. Surely to heaven, any civilized man believes in those, although even there, just as private enterprise has to be watched, it has to be guarded, rules of the road have to be made, you can't let free enterprise go hog wild, you know, you've got to restrain. So, also, we've learned this in the last 20, 25 years, we've learned that the welfare state also has to be watched. People will take advantage of it, just as some companies, some capitalists, some private enterprisers will skirt close to the law or even go a bit beyond it, or go a long way beyond it. Just as that danger is there, so in the welfare state, there is a danger that people will take advantage, wrong advantage, dishonest advantage, unfair advantage. Unemployment insurance, surely to God, is one of the finest things ever to come from the mind of man or from the hand of man, to introduce it. It was introduced, I believe, originally in Germany by Bismarck, I believe, Prince Bismarck. And Lloyd George, the great Chancellor of the Exchequer in the Liberal government of Asquith, and I don't know, but for a while, it is very early, he might have been even with Gladstone. Lloyd George, the great Liberal Chancellor of the Exchequer, you remember his famous Limehouse speech, one of the great political speeches of all time. It copied that social welfare innovation brought in by Prince Bismarck of Germany. And a lot of the social welfare state ideas, a lot of these originated in Germany, peculiarly enough, but they did. Well, that welfare state has really, in some ways, and in some of its main purpose, of course, is God-sent. Surely no civilized or religious-minded person can object, but any person can object when it's abused. And the abuse of the welfare state and the benefits that come under the welfare state, these benefits can be abused just as the benefits of the free enterprise system can be abused and are. So what am I now? At 83. Every ideal that I ever had in my life, I still have. That's enough to enable me to say, yes, I'm a socialist. But only if you're thinking of socialism as a sort of human welfare thing, you know. But if you're thinking of socialism as a system in which all industries, all mills, all factories, all mines, all shops, wholesale, retail, all trade, all commerce, all industry are owned and run by the state, by the government, by the state, which is what they've been trying to do in the Soviet Union now for, what is it, 60 years or more, with some success, but paying some pretty heavy penalties. It's true. If that's what you mean by socialism, I say no, God forbid.
Did you ever believe in that idea?
No, never. I never was a communist. Oh, I believed. Look, there was hardly a Canadian in Canada when you had 5 or 6 railway companies, each operating a railway, all of them losing their shirts, all of them breaking down, all of them failing. So that the people of Canada, the Canadian nation, was in horrible danger of their transportation system, which is free enterprise. That was free enterprise, you see. Private companies putting up their money, starting a railway here, starting a railway there, starting a railway. And there was a bunch of those railways, and they were Canada's means of getting people back and forth and goods back and forth and keep the country going. They were all collapsing. The government of Canada just took them all over, every one of them, and welded them together into one railway system, which became the biggest railway system on this earth, the Canadian National Railway, the CNR. The CNR was a great nationalized or socialized railway system that the government had to create because of the the terrible, the menacing failure of private enterprise. So, you know, all over the world, except maybe in the United States, which is the shrine of free enterprise, as you know, and where nationalization or collectivization or socialism are words that, if they had their way, these words would be blotted out of human mind. They wouldn't even allow the words, let alone the actuality, you see. But except in the United States now, all over the world, there is acceptance by everybody of the necessity for some nationalization. You must nationalize certain things. If not completely, that's why they started the Bank of England. There was not always a Bank of England. The banks were private enterprises, and most of the banks in England today are still private enterprises. But there is the Bank of Canada, the Bank of England, which is owned by England, by the people of England, by the government of England. It's a nationalized or a socialized bank, you see, which has a certain degree of control over all the private banks, the private enterprise banks. Well, you have also in Canada, the Bank of Canada. Most of the banks are privately owned and privately operated banks, but with the Bank of Canada, owned by the people of Canada. It's a socialized bank, and it controlling to a large extent the dozens of, in fact, I suppose there are a few thousand banks. Most of them are just branches. In the United States, the Federal Reserve System is a nationally owned, is socialized. It's about the only thing they have, I imagine, that is. But they had to have that because, well, the banks, that one of the first things you remember that Franklin Roosevelt did when he became president of the United States, I think it was either the same day or the next day or within a few days of being sworn in as the new president, he closed every bank in the United States of America. Every bank in America was shut down by presidential order while he was trying to sort it out, because these banks were failing. Right, left, and center, in dozens they were failing, you see. They were going bankrupt, and people were losing their money. And Roosevelt took the desperate step when necessary. So in virtually all countries, there is a recognition that some socialism or nationalization, you might put a more respectable word on it, public ownership, there are various words, is accepted.
What about a very recent attempt on the part of the government of Newfoundland and Labrador to nationalize, or I suppose the correct term would be to provincialize, Churchill Falls?
Well, they nationalize it. It was a forced purchase by the government of the shares, the controlling shares from Brinko and from the Churchill Falls Power Corporation, which was a private company. They forced them to sell them their shares, and having become the principal shareholder, owner of over half of the shares, having become the controlling shareholder, they just took it over. And they've owned it and operated it from that day to this. There were two men who denounced it. Two men in the world, at least in Newfoundland. I was one. I came out with a strong denunciation of it. I said it was a huge blunder, perhaps the biggest single blunder in Newfoundland's history, nationalizing Churchill Falls. Because they had to go out, and they had to go out and borrow, I think, $160 million. $160 million. They had to borrow it to get the money to pay for the shares. And on that $160 million, they have been paying interest ever since. So that up to the present time, the purchase of Churchill Falls by the Newfoundland government, the purchase of the shares of the company that owned it, you see, has cost close, well, it's well over $250 million cash that's come out of the pockets of the Newfoundland people. Now, what did that gain for Newfoundland? If you're going to buy a thing, if you're going to buy a house, it's to live in. You go and you live in it, and you enjoy, and your family live there, and you know, it's a nice thing to own a house. And if you have to borrow the money, if you haven't got enough money to build a house, and it's a bit expensive, and you borrow the money, well, you gradually pay it off in 15, 20, 18, 25 years, and you own it. That's better than just paying rent, because you can pay rent forever and ever and ever and never own it. Have to go on forever and ever and ever again. But if you buy it and you own it, the time comes when it's yours, and you don't owe any money on it except your taxes. All right. They put out perhaps more than $250 million. That's spelled with a B now, not million, of public money. And what did they gain? They did not gain one single mouse power, now let alone horsepower. They didn't gain enough electricity that wasn't already here. They didn't add to the amount of electricity enough to operate a little camera. They gained nothing in the way of power. They have the same power now that they had then. The lower Churchill, which will never be as big as the upper Churchill, but it's somewhere, it's around maybe 3 million horsepower. One of the world's great hydro developments, if it ever comes, and it must come, it will come, but that was ready to go. Churchill Falls Power Corporation, to build the upper Churchill, that cost $1 billion, $1,000 million to build it. They put together the greatest team of engineers, I suppose, since, bigger than Boulder Dam, bigger than any of the great American hydroelectric projects that Franklin Roosevelt put in, you remember? Bigger than any other hydro program in the whole world. That was the team they put together to build that mighty project, you see. Now it was done, just about done. And here they were able to switch that great team of people who built who planned and designed and built and supervised the actual construction. They were now ready to move down to the lower Churchill, where they would that would have cost at that time $500 million to do. It would cost half as much as it cost to build the upper Churchill. But today, no one in this world can develop the lower Churchill that should have been developed and could have been developed for less than half of $1 billion. Today, no one in the world can develop it for less than $5 billion. It'll cost much, 2, 3, 4 times as much now to develop the lower Churchill with its 3 million horsepower compared with the upper Churchill with its 10 million horsepower. To develop the 10 million horsepower costs $1 billion. To develop the 3 million horsepower, not 10 but 3 million, will cost probably 4 or 5 times as much as it did the upper Churchill. Now that would almost make you cry, because if that had gone ahead, and they were wonderfully eager and anxious to go ahead with it, the Churchill Falls Power Corporation, the corporation that built it, designed it, built it, and built it within not even a month over the planned time, and not $1 over the planned expenditure. That's engineering. That's a tremendous construction accomplishment. And they were eager to do it, and ready and willing and able to do it on the lower Churchill. If that had happened, the area today around Happy Valley and that
Lake Melville.
That whole Lake Melville area today would have employed, well, they'd have a population of 25,000 people. There would be, with the mills and factories that would be started there, based on the electricity, right there, right at the spot, low-cost electricity, do you see? Today there would be 4,000 to 5,000 men with jobs, high-paid jobs. You may yet see it because the world, is running short of energy, and electric energy, once you've got it, once it's developed, it costs you nothing except to pay the interest on the bonds that you had to sell, the money you had to borrow to build it. That takes time to get it paid off. But the actual operating is so little. It costs very little today to operate the upper Churchill. How many people are employed? A few hundreds of people, you see. They employed tens of thousands of people to build it, tens of thousands of people. But to operate it, once it's operated, your main cost then is to pay off the debt. You had to go in debt to build it. You didn't have the money, you had to borrow the money. You had to sell your bonds. You have to pay the interest on those bonds. And then when the bonds fall due, you have to pay the principal. And all that takes 25, 30, 40 years, you see.
What you're suggesting, then, it seems, is that the $250 million that the provincial government spent to buy the upper Churchill should have been spent to develop the lower Churchill.
Well, they didn't need to spend anything. They didn't. If they had allowed the company that planned it and organized it and built it and went out and borrowed the money to pay the cost of building it, if they'd allowed, let them leave them alone and let them go down and develop the lower Churchill, the Newfoundland government wouldn't have gone in debt one single sou, not a sou, let alone a cent. They wouldn't have gone in debt at all. And but what they would get would be the royalties, a share of the profits. See, the deal I made, I got the House of Assembly to adopt after I made it with the House of Rothschild and Brinko and so on. That deal gave us 10% off the top, no, 8% off the top of their profits that they would ever make as long as it would last. And then so much a horsepower, we would have taken in an awful lot of money. And we wouldn't have spent anything. We wouldn't have, the Newfoundland government wouldn't have spent a single nickel. Now, there are people, not many now, not for the last year or so, but for 8 or 9 years before that, I was no sooner out of office. Then they began to raise the hue and cry of the awful contract I had negotiated with Hydro-Quebec, that I had negotiated a terrible contract. I should be ashamed of myself. In fact, some people went a little further and said I almost should be shot. You know, it was a terrible contract that I negotiated and made and signed with Hydro-Quebec. Well, you're the one who negotiated it, you know. You who are doing the questioning in this program, or the operators of the cameras, they're the ones who, at least they did as much as I did. I had no more to do with negotiating the contract for the sale of the power from Churchill Falls to Hydro-Quebec. I had no more to do with negotiating that contract than a little child that was born the day before yesterday. Nor did I ever sign it, never signed it, nor did I ever see it. I've never seen it. I've never laid an eye to this moment on that contract. The contract was negotiated and made and signed by Churchill Falls Power Corporation Limited. Their directors negotiated, signed it, signed, sealed, and delivered it with Hydro-Quebec. Last year there was a case in the Supreme Court of Canada between the government of Newfoundland on the one hand and Quebec on the other about Churchill Falls. There was a case in the court. The lawyer for the Newfoundland government was Mr. Leonard Martin, very prominent lawyer from Corner Brook. He was retained by the Newfoundland government and he appeared in the court, the Supreme Court of Canada. And one of the judges, there are 9 judges on that bench, 9. And one of the judges, who evidently hadn't read up the papers very much, just leans forward on the bench. He says, but Mr. Martin, your government, the government of your province should have had that in mind when they negotiated that contract. Shouldn't they? And Mr. Martin said, no, my lord. The Newfoundland government didn't negotiate that contract. The Newfoundland government were strangers to that contract. I add, my lord, complete strangers to that contract. Now, when I heard about that, well, I was the Newfoundland government. I was its leader. When I heard about that, I got in touch with Mr. Martin. He said, oh, yes, that's what happened. And he said, I'll send you the record of it if you like. And he did, and I have it now. Then in the House of Assembly before Mr. John Crosby became a great statesman by going to Ottawa. He was Minister of Energy in the Newfoundland government, the administration of Mr. Moores. And I was in the House that very day when he made a speech.
Excuse me.
I'll let you know when it's...
Mr. Crosby made the declaration to the House of Assembly that the Newfoundland government had had nothing to do with making the contract with Hydro-Quebec. In fact, he said the Newfoundland government had no right to make a contract. The Newfoundland government had a director on the board. George Hobbs was the Newfoundland government's director on the board of directors of Churchill Falls Power Corporation.
What year would that have been? What year is this?
I don't remember the year.
In the early 70s, though.
Yeah, well, it'd be yes, very early 70s. I went out of office in 72, but now this statement by Mr. Crosby was made while I was back in the House for a short time, and he was the Minister of Energy in the Moores administration of the new government, you see. He said the Newfoundland government had nothing to do with making the contract. In fact, the Newfoundland government had no right to have anything to do with it. In fact, the Newfoundland government's own director, George Hobbs, who was, you remember, the chairman of the Newfoundland Hydro Commission, he had nothing to do with it. He wasn't even allowed to see it. That was done by the executive committee of the board of directors. Now, all big companies and all banks have big boards of directors, and not every member of that board of directors knows everything that goes on. They usually have an executive committee, and so did Churchill Falls Power, CFLCO they usually call it. So did they, and it was the executive committee. Now I have that speech by Mr. Now I have something else. I had a chat with George Hobbs, who is now retired, living in Pooch Cove. He confirms all that. See, but what they kept saying for years, until about a year ago, they don't need to say that anymore now. They just mention my name and Churchill Falls. And the lie that was spread around for 8 or 9 years, spread. Oh, was that lie spread? That I had negotiated the contract, I had made the contract, I had signed the contract. They don't say that anymore. They don't need to. But it was a lie from the beginning. It was never anything but a straight lie, which is not the first time that a lie has been spread about a politician, and I'm not the first politician about whom a lie was spread. You know.
So Churchill Falls was a case then where nationalization wasn't necessary at all.
It was not necessary.
Benefit to Newfoundland.
It was not necessary. We didn't need it. The people who had built it were excellent people. The people who were running it were excellent people. Newfoundland had everything to gain, nothing to lose, nothing to lose. Although you may remember that Mr. Moores, the Premier, came out with a big statement. It occupied almost one column in the Evening Telegram. I have it. I have a copy of it. He came out saying they had to nationalize the Upper Churchill. They had to. They were obliged to do it because that was the only way they could get the Lower Churchill developed. Well, it didn't develop the Lower Churchill, and it wasn't correct. No, I'm not going to say it was a lie. I'm going to say it was an inaccuracy. It was not correct. It wasn't the fact that they had to nationalize the Upper Churchill so as to get the Lower Churchill developed. That's not correct. That was never so. And no doubt he believed it. No doubt he had been persuaded by someone.
Why would he have been persuaded of this? I know you can't know that, but why do you think?
Well, I'll put it to you this way. There were people on the other side of politics And some of them had not always been on the other side. Some of them had been on my side, but were now on the opposite side of politics, who hated me with an unholy hatred, based on a number of things, one of them being jealousy, who seized every chance they could get when they came in power themselves, seized every chance to give me a bad name, and all my works to try to do away with them. The oil refinery never should have closed in Cumberchance. Never should have closed. Churchill Falls never should have been nationalized. The big paper mill was just about, when I went out of office, was just at the edge of being ready to operate. It should be operating and producing paper, linerboard paper, there at Stephenville within a year of my leaving office. It was 3 years. It shouldn't have taken that time. They should never have nationalized it. Never in the wide world. There was no need, and that has cost the Newfoundland people $500 million. It was almost $500 million that Churchill Falls cost the Newfoundland people, and the same, only a little more, in Stephenville. So you're talking about $1,000 million, $1 billion added onto our debt by closing down one of my projects and nationalizing the other. That was not done because it was necessary. If a thing is necessary, it's necessary. You have to do it. That's that. It's necessary. Neither of these was necessary. It was not necessary to nationalize Churchill Falls. It was not necessary to nationalize Stephenville. It was not necessary to let Cumberchance go down the drain.
It sounds like a political party who nationalizes this way doesn't conform to the usual idea of a conservative party. This sounds like it's more socialist than,
well, yes,
at least in some certain
yes.
instances.
Oh, it was done with pure patriotism, you understand. Pure patriotism.
To get back to our talk about your political development, when did you decide, can you say when, you came to the conclusion that liberalism was the correct political course to take rather than socialism? You already pointed out that liberalism embraces certain aspects or qualities of socialism, certain socialist ideals, but that there are certain differences. At what point?
Well, to start with, here in Newfoundland, you know, there was a socialist party here. I told you about that. And it was when the superintendent of police tipped off his own son that the police were going to raid the Sunday school. They actually had a socialist Sunday school. They were all Christians, you see, all of them. That was sort of the end of the socialist movement in Newfoundland. They had maybe 12 or 15 members, all respectable businessmen, Christian men. It was a Christian socialist movement, you see, a branch of the Christian socialist movement in England. Well, when I became old enough to be active in politics, well, the first time, before I was old enough, when I couldn't even vote, I backed the Working Men's Party in St. John's West, worked hard for it. Linegar, Cadwell, and Foley. That was 1919. That was my first election. I was 19 years old. You had to be 21 to vote. I didn't even have a vote. But when, you know, after the defeat of that party, with just a handful of votes they got in St. John's West, and I began to look more closely than I had ever done before that at the Liberal Party and what they stood for. Then I began to study Newfoundland history, and I knew the history of the great Sir William Whiteway, the greatest of them all, the great Sir Robert Bond, and so on. I said, why, in Newfoundland, the Liberal Party is the Socialist Party. In Newfoundland, it's the Liberal Party that's the party of the common people, and the Tory party is the Merchants' Party, is the Water Street Party, and so it was. The Tory party, long before they called themselves the Tory or Conservative, they called themselves the Merchants' Party, because that made them respectable. A lot of people in Newfoundland, you know, who had the feeling, well, after all, you know, a merchant party, where would we be without the merchants? And it gave it a certain amount of respectability and so on. Now, they didn't win too often, but they were not hated and despised or spat upon. People on balance preferred the Liberal Party because they were more obviously and clearly on the side of the common man, you see. Well, as I learned these things, I said, well, I'm a Liberal. I became a Liberal then, and I've been that ever since, and that's now, let us say that was 20 off of 83. 63 years ago I became a Liberal, and I've been one ever since, without ceasing all that time to have some left of center. See, liberalism prides itself on being in the center, in the middle. To the right of them are the Tories. To the left of them are the socialists. But in the center, the Liberal Party. Well, in becoming a centrist, I was really more than a little bit to the left. And there have been lots of liberals like that, you know. In fact, in the Tory party, you know what the term red Tory means? Any Tory in Ottawa who is a bit to the left, it's called a red Tory. Not just an ordinary Tory, but a red Tory. What's her name, who was the MacDonald? Flora MacDonald is a red Tory. And others are red Tories. In other words, if you're a Tory and you're not away to the right, you're a bit to the left, you're a red Tory. In other words, you're really a liberal in disguise.
There must be an overlap, I suppose.
Yes.
To some degree. When you became premier in 1949, you had been away from socialism, at least the Socialist Party of the United States, for a couple of decades. Did you bring, though, to your administration any of those socialist ideals, more than would have perhaps been the case had you not had your early encounters with and experiences in socialism?
Oh, I learned, frankly, the fact of the matter is, though, it was in the United States that I first began to practice being a socialist. It was when I went to live in England that I learned the genuine thing, the real thing, you see. And so I brought from England to my premiership much more than I brought from the United States. For instance, I've been a very strong supporter of the British parliamentary system of government, the parliamentary system, as against the American congressional system. I prefer the British. I think it's far more democratic. I think it's a far better system of government. And I brought that with me into the premiership. And as for my socialist ideals, by then, not having, you know, for so many years been a member of a socialist party for a quarter of a century, and that's a long time, I suppose, in any man's life, I was not an active socialist. I was a socialist in ideals. Sure, everybody should be. Lord Milner, you remember, I was talking on the telephone a couple of days ago. No, yesterday I was talking on the telephone. I had a chat with the Honourable William J. Brown. I don't know whether I offended him. I said, Mr. Brown, I'm going to say something to you now that will surprise you, and I'm not sure that you're going to like it. But I'm going to say it anyhow, by way of no harm. He said, sure, go ahead. I said, I've always regarded you as being a genuine liberal, always through your life, on the record, not the parties you've joined. I don't count that as part of the record. But on the record, your life, your career, when you were a judge, when you were a magistrate, all through your life, you've given every evidence of being a man with socialist ideals. You never joined any socialist party. You joined the Liberal Party. He was a candidate, you know, for Sir Richard Squires up in Placentia Bay. He ran as a Liberal candidate, but only once. Then he became a Tory candidate. But I said, look, regardless of what political party you've been with, you yourself, essentially, in your own temperament, your own personality, your own character, in your own basic beliefs, you are a Liberal. And he didn't get angry about that. Well, this British system I prefer. I think it's the best system of government in the world, and it's more the British type of socialism that I preferred.
Can you look back at your career as a premier and see any actions that you took or any of the accomplishments that you achieved and say that these were things that I did probably because of my socialist sympathies?
I think just about everything. But remember that no matter how idealistic you are, no matter how pro-working class you are, no matter how much your mind and your heart operate in sympathy with the common people, what Abraham Lincoln, you remember, called the common people. Abraham Lincoln said one time, God must have loved the common people. He made so many of them. Well, while I was operating that way, I was always practical enough to know, look, what is the best way to help the working class, the worker, the man with nothing but his labor, nothing but his hands to work with? Well, what's the best way to help him? Just to be sympathetic to him, to preach, read poetry to him, play some music to him, preach a sermon at him? No, the best way to help him is to get him a job, create an industry. And so I went out on my famous slogan, develop or perish. That's what faces. Those were the alternatives. We could have one or the other. We could perish or we could develop. Now there was a third one, and I counted that as part of perishing. You could leave Newfoundland. You could perish, or you could save yourself from perishing by leaving Newfoundland, but I counted that part of perishing. You would perish as a Newfoundlander. And I used to put it this way in speeches. If 10,000 young men leave Newfoundland and go off to Canada, to the United States, or anywhere, they leave Newfoundland, they take their blood with them. They don't leave their blood behind. And Newfoundland perishes from loss of blood. The blood is gone. It's gone in the veins of the thousands of Newfoundlanders who go off, and Newfoundland is left that much poorer. We must develop or we will perish. And perishing includes losing our population, you see, losing our people. Well, develop meant developing industries. It meant developing the schools. It meant developing parks. It meant developing roads. It meant developing airports. Development is development. Creating, building, creating, developing, creating. And so when I said develop or perish, I didn't mean only factories. I didn't mean only mines. I didn't mean only paper mills. I didn't mean only oil refineries. I didn't mean only agriculture and forestry and electricity. That's development too, of that kind. But then man does not live by bread alone. Man does not live by industries alone. If you had a job for every young man in Newfoundland today, a job at fairly good pay, do you think that would solve Newfoundland's problem? No way. You've got to make Newfoundland not only a place where you can make a decent living and have a girl and get married and have a family and have a home and have a house. Not only that, not enough. You can get that anywhere. You don't have to stay in Newfoundland to get that. You've got to get something else, and you've got to get it in Newfoundland, or you won't stay in Newfoundland. You've got to have athletics. You've got to have recreation. you've got to have sport, you've got to have theatre, you've got to have dancing, you've got to have singing, you've got to have all the things that go to fill up your mind and your heart and your soul. And you can't do that just with a job, can you? And so I included that in my development. That's why I built those great arts and culture centres in Newfoundland. That's part of it. That's why I helped to get museums started. That's why I helped with the Arts and Letters contest. That's been going on now ever since the first year I became Premier. And no one would dare to drop it. All these are ways to develop Newfoundland. Develop or perish. That's your choice. Develop or perish.
Thank you.
That covers it.